Oh, I've never heard that. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to attending the Santa Clara River Watershed Committee this Thursday. And we have, if you could, for welcomes, there's two people on the phone. If you maybe put in the chat who you're representing, that'll be great. Laura's got the roll call. Is there any other information we need to receive from anyone? Any new people that we don't know? Raise your hand. Okay, well, if you are new, and for me, it's an open forum. Either raise your hand in the participants, or when I ask for any questions or comments, just go right ahead.
I see Christian Broderick looked a little bit different in his profile pic than he did last Thursday night.
I de-aged.
Yeah, I saw that one too. That's creative.
Good one. Well, as long as we don't have any cats on our screen, I think we're going to be good today. Okay, next is our committee updates and announcements. Does anyone have any? Anyone have any updates?
I'll share, Chair Long, I'll share a little bit later again, but I do want to announce that the Fillmore and Piru Basin GSA is continuing to have intense stakeholder engagement on finishing up the sustainable management criteria and commenting on the groundwater dependent ecosystems tech memo. And we have Christian Broderick here to give at least a sneak peek. I asked him to drop in as a much more valuable substitute than me trying to describe it, but I'm sure he struggled with how he's going to cover that subject with this area. So just, you know, we have some excellent information on the Fillmore and Piru GSA website that's available. We have a recording available of Christian's presentation last week, and we're having a special meeting on the 1st. So Fillmore and Piru commercial as an early announcement.
Yes, thank you. April 1st, 5 p.m. It's on Zoom, and you can find it on our website for fpbgsa.com, I believe. Any other announcements? And seeing none or hearing none, let's go to our flood management aquifer recharge. And we have Cam. Go ahead, Angela.
Yes. I just wanted everyone to know that maybe within the next month and a half to 2 months, we'll be releasing a detailed notice of preparation for the Santa Clara River levee improvements upstream of Highway 101. This is along the River Park area, heading up along that Woolsey Basin, and then taking a sharp right turn between Woolsey Basin and Faro Basin and heading towards high ground near Vineyard Avenue. So this is basically to provide 100-year flood protection for the area behind the levee. So I'll probably send a link to the notice of preparation when it does become publicly available to Laura, so she can spread the word to everyone who regularly attends these meetings as well. Thanks.
Great. Anyone have any questions for Angela on that? No? Any other comments before we go to the flood management? And seeing none, we have Kamar. I'm saying your name wrong. I apologize. How do you pronounce it?
It's Kamyar.
Kamyar. Thank you. Sorry.
No problem.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to bring up my slides.
And Kamyar, I don't know if there's anyone else from your team on the call, but I just want to make sure you get a chance to introduce yourselves, and at some point, maybe after the presentation, you can put your contact information in the chat too.
I will, and it's on one of my slides,
which we always post after the meetings. If anyone before preemptively answer that question for anyone, we'll be posting a PDF of slides on our website, and I'll send an email out afterwards.
Very good. Are you able to see my slide?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you, Supervisor Long, for the introduction. And I want to thank Laura for spending some time with us here at DWR or with my colleagues to give us some insights on your interest in flood managed aquifer recharge, or FloodMAR as we call it, and make sure that what I share with you is what you would like to learn about our work. This photo on the title slide is a vineyard, certainly in the winter time, that was using FloodMAR, taking flood flows on vineyards. Oops. Hang on. Okay. So this is probably not news to you, but California is a Mediterranean climate. Our water is all about the extremes, and this timeline along the top shows flood events in the bluish color since the 1960s, and on the bottom of the timeline are drought events, and you can see that we can actually experience both in a given water year. Climate change is making these extremes more frequent, more intense, and more consequential. This plot is simulated, but using historical data from 1980 through 2100 of flows in the American River. And the gray lines are the first 30 years, 1980 to 2010. And the amber lines are the last 30, 2070 through 2100. And this trend of earlier and higher runoff in the wintertime and lower runoff in the summertime is something we're going to experience in many of our watersheds and river systems in California. And as you know, much of our water infrastructure and our operational rules, including Corps of Engineer rules for reservoir ops, are based on historical hydrology. And so we're really going to have to rethink how we manage and to modernize our infrastructure to be able to reduce flood risk in the wintertime while preparing ourselves for those inevitable drought periods, which we may actually be entering into right now. I like to share this graphic. This flower diagram is intended to represent the various sectors of water management in the petals. And historically, we tend to operate around the periphery of this flower, where there's little or no overlap between our various water sectors. But really, to become more sustainable and resilient, we have to get our water sectors to move toward the center of this flower, where we're going to maximize the overlap. And what we mean by that is, having more collaboration amongst our entities. The agency efforts have to be more aligned, and we have to actually begin co-managing our watersheds amongst our various sectors. And this is what we are now calling integrated watershed management. And it's really all about that multi-sector collaboration, bringing to bear multiple disciplines when we plan for our water, and making sure that our projects more and more serve multiple purposes and benefits, and finding ways to knit together the pots of money that our various water sectors have to implement those multiple benefit projects. And in many respects, flood managed aquifer recharge epitomizes this integrated watershed management approach. In its simplest description, it's about taking high flows and spreading them on agricultural working lands and natural managed lands for the purpose of recharging depleted aquifers. So some of the attributes of FloodMAR is that it really needs to be voluntary as a public-private partnership, because many of the agencies and water sectors are in the public sphere, while the land and the landowners are in the private sphere. I've also already mentioned the multi-sector nature of flood managed aquifer recharge. The other neat thing about FloodMAR is it's scalable. FloodMAR is not something DWR just invented. It's been going on for the last 20, 30 years on a small scale. So there are farmers and growers who have been taking advantage of high flows because they're in the vicinity of canals or streams that enable them to divert some of the high peak flows onto their farmland. But one of the other neat things is it's scalable in that it can also be implemented at a GSA level, at a basin scale level, and an entire watershed. And one of the things that that we're learning through our watershed studies is that the larger the spatial scale, particularly up to the watershed, the more benefits and advantages that FloodMAR can provide. The other neat thing about FloodMAR is it's multifaceted. It's not one particular type of project, but a number of different activities can help promote this FloodMAR approach. And my next slide will demonstrate that. And then it's an untapped part of our California water portfolio because, 150 years ago, we built levees to keep the flood system and the agricultural lands separate and apart. But now, because of those increasing extreme events and the fact that we're going to have less flows in the summertime and higher flood risk in the wintertime, we really have an opportunity to take advantage of that through a FloodMAR type approach. So at a watershed scale, this is about a headwaters to groundwater strategy. That's why all the sectors really need to be involved. So at the headwater scale, forecast-informed reservoir operations can be part of a FloodMAR strategy. By anticipating that next atmospheric river and drawing down the reservoir in advance, it can then capture more of the peak flood flows to reduce flood risk downstream, and then expanding outlet structures and actually creating a pool within the reservoir that could be seen as a groundwater recharge pool. Once that water is released, we're likely going to need new and expanded conveyance facilities and also expanded bypasses and floodplains, and using our floodplains and flood bypasses as a way of getting the drawdown water from FIRO, forecast-informed reservoir ops, down into the lower watershed area. But once you do that, we really need to have a handle on which lands are most suitable for recharge and which crops are most accepting of standing water for periods of time. So obviously, if you have annual crops, farmers who participate in a flood-mar program could make that make those decisions early on, if particularly if there's a landowner compensation program and recharge credits, maybe to not plant their annual crop in a year where we know there's going to be opportunities to use their lands for recharge. But more and more research and pilot projects are showing that even permanent crops like vineyards and some orchards are able to withstand standing water for an extended period of time in the wintertime without affecting their productivity. There's also work that would be needed to find suitable recharge methods and where those prime recharge areas are to get the most water into the ground quickly. The other thing we're demonstrating and observing is that this can all be done in a way to create more terrestrial habitat for birds and other terrestrial species, while also as the groundwater elevation is increased through this continuous recharge program, more water will accrete as base flow to the adjacent streams, providing better aquatic habitat, particularly in the dry times when the fish are most stressed. So the other good news is that over the last 3-4 years, the state of California and a number of our planning documents have cited flood-mar and recommended that it be part of our ongoing activities. And that includes the Newsom administration's water resilience portfolio. So some of the ways that have been identified on how the state of California, the government, can help extend and fast-track flood-mar is first and foremost, change our thinking about aquifers. We think of forests and wetlands and riparian habitat as natural and green infrastructure, but because groundwater until Sigma was kind of off the state management radar, aquifers have never really been recognized as natural green infrastructure, but they do provide many ecosystem services when they're healthy that would benefit the state overall. And by doing so, that will create new fiscal and regulatory incentives by the state to promote additional aquifer recharge and replenishment projects by providing state cost share. The other thing we have to really pay attention to is make sure we don't pave over our prime recharge sites as we go forward. And then again, finding ways to create these public-private partnerships to advance this strategy. A part of that public-private partnership is we have to create markets that incentivize flood-mar. So thinking of recharge for flood risk reduction is a really new way of thinking about things. This is not what we normally do. And so that, I think, in and of itself will bring the flood management community together with the groundwater management community for common advantages. The other opportunity here is thinking of groundwater as environmental places for environmental water accounts. So imagine if during a high flow period, farmers were paid state or federal funding through our resource agencies to bank some of that water in their aquifer for the purpose of using that water during the next dry period rather than divert water from the adjacent stream and leave more of that water for the aquatic habitat and the fish. Also, I think we have to begin rethinking the use of our language, our words. So rather than ag land retirement or land fallowing, why not think of repurposing cultivated lands that may not in any one particular year have enough groundwater because of sigma to cultivate that. So if we could imagine 20, 30% of farmers' land being used for crop rotation, for healthy soils management, or dedicated recharge basins, or ecosystem restoration easements, or maybe even solar farms that could actually have recharge occurring beneath them. The Department of Water Resources has been working and thinking about floodmar since about 2017. And we can describe the work that we're doing in these three areas. Well, one is the watershed studies. I'll touch on the Merced study in a bit. And this is really to demonstrate analytically how at a watershed scale, a floodmar can provide benefits to multiple sectors, the flood sector, groundwater sector, ecosystem, and water quality. The other work that we're doing is identifying partners to do pilot projects at multiple scales, again, to demonstrate the benefits of floodmar. And then along the way, we have been putting together guidance information through white papers and research plans, and we'll be developing technical memoranda describing all of this work going forward. The other thing that we're working on is trying to knit all of this work together along with partners through a floodmar network. And we've been working on that for the last year to build the network. And I'll say more about that in a minute. When we started working on this, we felt it would be prudent to get our arms around the body of information about the floodmar strategy. And we recognize that there's lots of people and entities that have been working on this. So we put a white paper together. It's posted on our website. I encourage you to take a look at it. It's very short and will help you understand. And again, this wasn't just DWR authorship. We work with our partners to put this together. And there's a robust discussion of all the public benefits and private benefits that floodmar can provide. The other important thing we wanted to recognize is which of those public benefits has the state been able to really promote and advance. In Prop 1, as you know, there's the Storage Investment Grant Program. And interestingly, but understandably, aquifer replenishment is not identified as one of the public benefits that would be eligible for getting funding through that storage program, which does include groundwater storage and conjunctive water management. One thing, and I think the reason is this chapter of Prop 1 was written prior to Sigma. And so I think moving forward, again, we should really look at recognizing aquifers as natural infrastructure. The other thing that we included in the white paper is memorializing what people are saying is difficult about doing floodmar, and they're organized in these different under these different categories, including things like water rights, regulations, and permitting. The next step from this white paper was, how do you go about tackling these data and information gaps? And so DWR helped convene a research advisory committee. The committee had about 30 members, half of whom were from the state and half of whom were non-state, intentionally organized around 13 subcommittees. And if you look at the names of these various subcommittees, you'll see it spans the entire set of disciplines that are needed to fill those data and information gaps. Those subcommittees, the committee members reached out to others to help work on these subcommittees. So a total of about 200 people helped put this research and data development plan together. They identified 130 key information gaps, and we asked them, each of the subcommittees, to prioritize their top 3. So the plan, which is also posted online, describes those 39 priority actions, and then there are 13 appendices, one for each subcommittee, which describes all 130 recommended actions to fill the gaps. It was the Research Advisory Committee that finally, as an overarching recommendation in the plan, said, let's not make this a one and done activity. Let's build a FloodMar network so that we can continue to exchange information and know who's doing what moving forward. In 2019, DWR convened a FloodMar forum. It was attended by, it was a 2-day forum, and each day we had about 200 people. And out of that forum came about a dozen recommended actions, organized around 5 objectives that are on this slide. I did send Laura a 4-page summary of this forum, including those 12 recommended actions, to share with you. So now thinking about everything, the white paper and the research and data development plan is kind of in that guidance bucket. This now is talking about the watershed studies, and we are working on one in the Tuolumne River, partnering with the Corps of Engineers and the folks in the watershed. But the one I'd like to describe today is the Merced River FloodMar reconnaissance study. And we're partnering with Merced Irrigation District, Sustainable Conservation, and others on this. This study is really describing an approach that I think has portability that can be applied in other watersheds. First and foremost, it's about developing an integrated headwaters to groundwater tool set. And the graphic here shows the 9 models that are part of the Merced study tool set. A number of these models are from Merced Irrigation District. A number are from flood community. And DWR took these and improved on some of them and linked them together. One of the new features is what's called the groundwater recharge optimization tool, or GRAT, that was developed by Sustainable Conservation and Earth Genome. Once the tool set was developed, we've utilized it for 2 key purposes. One is doing a risk-based climate vulnerability assessment. And by risk-based, I mean building on the downscale global climate model approach, but taking a bottom-up approach, a more of a sensitivity analysis approach, which we call decision scaling, to not just know the range of possibility with climate change, but also the probability of occurrence of the different conditions. Once the assessment's done, the vulnerability assessment, then we use this tool set to evaluate how existing and new infrastructure could be operated to advance floodmar. We're taking a multi-benefit strategy approach. So while we're doing that, we want to make sure we're reducing flood risk, improving water supply reliability, groundwater sustainability, and ecosystem, both terrestrial and aquatic benefits. Online, and I can send Laura the link to our Floodmar page. It's actually on my last slide, where we have a plan of study describing the Merced Floodmar study. And at the end of the slide deck, and I don't have enough time to go through them, I've included another 8 or 9 slides with more detailed example results from the Merced River Floodmar reconnaissance study. And if there's interest from your committee, we'd be happy to schedule a follow-on discussion to get into more detail of the Merced River study. We're also, as I mentioned, working with a number of partners to help formulate pilot project plans. One is working with the Nature Conservancy on the Sac Valley Multi-Benefit Demonstration Project, which is really looking to use floodwaters on ag lands to provide bird habitat. More recently, we are working with the river partners and the San Joaquin River Conservancy on a San Joaquin Valley floodplain recharge program. And this also includes part of the Conservancy has gravel pits that are no longer being used as gravel pits to see if and how they could become good recharge areas for floodwaters. We are working with the Merced Irrigation District, not only in the watershed study, but here's the neat thing. They're planning to use the tool set that's been developed for this as part of their real-time operations of their headwater to groundwater system. They're also now looking at the results of some of those studies and working with us to formulate a pilot project. For instance, what could be gained by keeping irrigation ditches full for a longer period of time, including the winter time when they're not being used for cultivation purposes. We're also working with a newer group called the San Joaquin Valley Multi-Benefit or San Joaquin Valley Water Collaboration Action Program to look at some multi-benefit water planning in the San Joaquin Valley. And we're open to other pilot project prospects. The next few slides are gonna talk about what kind of technical assistance might DWR be able to provide folks around floodmar, then financial assistance and some regulatory. We can work with folks on what we would call initial studies, more of a spreadsheet analysis to gauge if there's enough there for floodmar to warrant doing a more detailed analysis like what I described for the Merced River watershed. DWR, our Sigma program, has funding for both planning assistance, technical assistance, and financial assistance. Around $200 million continually funded, and a number of that work could be used to support a floodmar pilot project or a more permanent project. One of the neat things that DWR is just about ready to launch is we call it AEM, aerial electromagnetic stratigraphy. And one of the big data gaps that is identified is we don't have a good understanding of where the high recharge areas are versus not. And this new technology, and you can kind of see it in the lower photo, a helicopter basically flies around with an instrument that can then look several hundred feet down through the geology and identify not just the surface porosity, but the deep ground aquifer porosity. We also have, and the Water Board, a number of financial assistance program, which I know some of you are aware of, like the IRWM grant program, but also the Sustainable Groundwater Management Implementation Grants. And I know for a fact that a few IRWM grant awards, recent awards, have been for included floodmar type projects. So as IRWM groups and GSAs submit applications for these grants, they could include floodmar projects. We often get asked, well, how does this work from a water rights perspective? And this is certainly one of the areas that we're going to have to continue to work with the Water Board on. The Water Board, actually out of the last drought, has set up a temporary permit process. It's not a water right, but for floodmar type activities that could range from 6 months to 5 years to do floodmar pilots or projects to test it out and see if it would work for a particular watershed area or a GSA. They've also set up a streamlined water rights process for GSAs that is described on their website. I put the URL there. This is a more short-term or temporary in scope and time. And then there's certainly always the standard long-term water right process. This is my last slide, just to note that for floodmar to work, again, because of its multi-sector and multi-institution nature, particularly at the larger spatial scales like watersheds, there are many entities have a role to play to make that happen. And I'm sure your watershed committee members will identify with one or more of these roles. And we certainly encourage you to participate in the floodmar network. We've had 3 workshops so far. We'll have another one soon to continue to build on that. Now, this rocket ship going off in the upper right is meant to underscore this is a moonshot. This is not, it sounds simple, but there are a lot of things that have to be worked out to make this work at the watershed scale. But I would argue and assert that it's imperative given the climate and other risks that we are confronted with. So this is my last presentation slide. It does have my, this is our floodmar listserv or email address and the website. Again, after this are 9 other slides that you'll have about the Merced study. And I'd be happy to take any questions. I'm going to go ahead and unshare so that we can see each other. Thank you.
So there's been a lot of questions actually in the chat that I've been trying to keep a list so I can scroll back to the order that they've kind of come in. But so thank you for this presentation. It seems there's a great interest. And I know that we've already, we've had a lot of projects that focus on flood management and aquifer recharge in Ventura County in this watershed, and that we've, even had IRWM projects funded that are would fit into this sort of category. So I'm going to scroll back here. I think one of the first questions came from Angela with the Public Works Agency, and was wondering if there's particular categories of agriculture that are not recommended for flooding due to food safety concerns. If that's, and this kind of relates to another question from someone else in the chat that I jotted down, that was about what the farming community's perspective is on this and kind of the adoption that you see from the farming community.
Thank you, Angela, for that question. As far as the reception we've received from the farming community, it's been better than I had ever expected. And I think the driver, not surprisingly, is Sigma. Many of those growers are covered by GSAs, and they are putting together, or either have or are putting together their plans for how they're going to meet their Sigma goals in the next 20, 30 years. And FloodMar is one of the strategies that many people are looking at. And I think part of it is because it is recognized that it's that untapped part of our water portfolio, because often the periods and flow conditions that we're talking about are times when most people did not want that water and were not able to manage it. Now, for FloodMar, there would have to be the conveyance and exchange facilities created to be able to get the floodwaters onto the lands. As far as suitability, crop suitability, that's actually a big part of one of the subcommittees of the Research Advisory Committee, and their appendix goes into great detail there. There's been a lot of work and more on the way to see which crops, particularly the permanent crops, are most suitable for a FloodMar approach. And we'd certainly be happy to point you to that appendix and that information. I know that a number of universities, particularly UC Davis, has and is doing research on that. But again, growers are some of the most advocates, the greatest advocates of looking at to do this, because they understand that this could be one way that they're going to keep more of their farm in cultivation.
Thank you. I'm just going to try to keep us moving through some of the questions already asked. So the next question, Tony, I don't know if you wanted to ask it directly, but you asked about California law and recognizing doesn't recognize aquifer recharge as a beneficial use of the waters of the state. Do you think that the legislature might consider changing that?
So two things. One is terminology matters, words matter. So groundwater recharge and beneficial use versus aquifer replenishment and public benefit. And they're not the same. So when it comes to groundwater recharge and beneficial use, this is a state water board water right thing. And so for them, recharge is a storage activity, not a diversion activity. The use occurs when someone extracts the groundwater recharge. However, they have heard, they've gotten an earful about this, and they now do have a policy paper posted on their website that describes what they say in situ beneficial use. So to the extent that groundwater recharge results in aquifer replenishment, that is considered an in situ beneficial use. What that means, though, is that if you put in 50 units of water you can't pull all 50 units of water out and say you've replenished the aquifer. You will have to leave some of that in there, and the amount that you leave in there, that's the in situ beneficial use. But the point that I was making is that aquifers can be replenished by recharge, but also other ways, like improving contaminated or replenishing contaminated aquifers or salty aquifers. So the act of replenishing an aquifer is a public benefit that could, this is me talking, if it were recognized as natural infrastructure and its replenishment as a public benefit, it could make it eligible for funding from that next water bond whenever it happens. But Prop 1 did not explicitly describe it that way. So that's what's really important here. So I think the Water Board is coming along on the beneficial use, describing this in situ, but again, the act of recharge in their minds is storage, not a use, extractive use.
Are there any follow-up questions on that, or? Okay.
So I guess, Laura, I guess my point is, if I know the intent of getting the Water Board to say recharge as a beneficial use is trying to promote getting more of this done through the water rights process. But I think if the emphasis becomes aquifers as natural infrastructure and public benefits for replenishment, that can get us to the same place, maybe even faster, by getting more funds into this process. We still are going to have to work on the water rights and the permitting side, but I don't think they're one and the same.
Okay. There was a question also about the aerial survey unit that you talked about, and porosity of aquifers. Does that unit, is it able to get the porosity below developed areas or only undeveloped?
No, it can, well, by developed, if you mean paved areas, even if we got the porosity, I don't know how you would recharge it, but it I believe will be, can do urban areas, but you know, I don't know the paved areas would be as instrumental in future groundwater recharge. Our SIGMO office is the one that's leading this. They've just completed the pilot project to make sure that there was enough there, and they now are in the final contracting process to begin a statewide survey using the AEM. The other neat thing about this technology is that it can also be done on the ground, and it's been called TOTEM. The other one's SkyTEM. And the TOTEM, you can take that similar unit, put it behind a tractor, and drive back and forth on your land, and it can also provide that kind of information, even at a finer spatial scale.
All right, I'm just going to keep moving from what I saw in the chat. I think we might be catching up soon. So Tom Dudley also had asked about, somebody asked about incorporating, how this incorporates active injection technology.
You know, active injection technology is more of an urban phenomena. And I'm glad you brought that up, because Floodmar is kind of the rural open space analog to what is often called stormwater capture and management, that is more of an urban, has been used in urban settings. The concepts are exactly the same, but in urban settings, because you don't have as much open area for recharge, doing injections is sometimes the only option. But in an ag setting, it would not be cost effective to do it that way. Just spreading it on the land. Plus, with the spreading, you get these environmental benefits that you wouldn't through injection wells.
All right, I kind of lost track at this point. So if anyone has
If you have any burning questions, let me know.
If anyone else saw a question in the chat, you want to unmute burning questions or perspective for Ventura County. If you guys, have thoughts on projects that maybe we haven't talked about, that this is, that FloodMAR applies to, that you wanted to bring up. I remember there was also a question about Prop 68 and how you see FloodMAR being funded potentially through Prop 68.
I think and that's why I included that in one of my slides. I think it can be eligible. Obviously, you would have to frame and describe your project, FloodMAR project, in a way that was consistent with the bond language for those particular chapters. But I think it's totally relevant. The other thing that I'd like to add, in our discussion with Laura, we learned that the Santa Clara River watershed area has a number of models and tools that have been developed for flood and water management and groundwater. And what that tells us here at DWR is you're very well positioned to work on an integrated tool set from headwater to groundwater to begin uncovering these unrealized opportunities by virtue of managing your watershed across your sectors, not only anecdotally, but quantitatively. And by doing the climate vulnerability risk-based assessment, you'll be able to show compelling evidence why the flood risk is going to be a big driver in the future, if not now, and how FloodMAR can help reduce that flood risk while improving your groundwater resources. And we intentionally, when we started this, stuck the word flood and MAR together, because in many cases when we talk about this, people are more focused on the managed aquifer recharge. Again, understandably, because of Sigma. But to me personally, from the public's perspective, managing that flood risk in the future is going to be even more compelling reason to make investments to do FloodMAR as a way of reducing that flood risk, while at the same time preparing your watershed for that next inevitable drought.
Amyar, I have a question. Thank you so much for coming today to participate in this discussion. I think it's opening up a lot of future discussions, I think, for our area. So I really appreciate it. Do you see as much opportunity for FloodMAR on the scale that would maybe justify the cost in a drier area like Southern California relative to the benefits in more northern parts of the state where flooding is a more common occurrence? Have you seen much FloodMAR in the way you're describing it implemented in Southern California?
Well, again, in Southern California, it's called stormwater management. So because there's less ag land, certainly on the urbanized areas. So the fact that people are doing stormwater capture and using that water to recharge aquifers along the coast tells me that it has penciled out. And the other thing that you have there is saltwater intrusion into your groundwater basin, coastal basins. And so as sea level rises, you have another imperative for keeping your groundwater levels higher to repel that saltwater intrusion. So I would say floodmar from an agricultural perspective is not as prevalent in the urbanized parts of Southern California. But this I do know, while there aren't as many flood events, when they do occur, they can create a lot more damage in urbanized areas. So if you could imagine ag rural areas inland from the urbanized areas that could capture and spread out these floodwaters, that would be a lot of damage reduction to the downstream urban areas. And to me, that means ka-ching, the urban areas can help invest in those upstream floodmar programs because it provides them a benefit.
Thank you. That's great.
Just real quick, when we're talking about buying more water, refueling generating the aquifers, we've also run into just the flow rates, and due to GDEs and so forth, how that plays a part. Is there any direction from DWR as to any of that?
Kelly, can you say a little more about the flow rates? What aspect of the flow rates have been?
Oh, sorry, my microphone is low. Apologize. Mostly just at what flow rates can we run? Sometimes there are max flow rates that you have to run because of the GDE or some other requirement. And so trying to understand from the DWR what those are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you for that. I think those are at this point in time more controlled by water board standards and requirements. So for instance, in the streamline permit process, water board at this point in time has said, okay, if you're going to do a floodmar type project, you have to take the water above the 90 percentile flow, and you can only take a portion of that water. So those are the constraints. But what people don't know, because again, they haven't done the climate vulnerability assessment, is 90% peak flow today is not 90% peak flow in 20 years or 30 years. And the amount of water that's going to be occurring during those peak flows are not the same. So you've got to, this watershed study approach and climate vulnerability assessment is what can really help your watershed quantify if there's enough there. Now, I think Lynn asked, how do we know if there's enough there to do something like this? And that's where we do suggest you could do a spreadsheet type analysis, and we can certainly share with you how we've done it elsewhere to get your arms around if there's enough there for floodmar to move forward with a more detailed watershed study like we're doing in the Merced. Again, my gut tells me, and from the results, and over this summer, we're going to be getting a lot more results from that study, and some of the climate change scenarios that we're looking at. You know, and one of the slides I've included in the supplemental information you have now shows a 1956 flood event in the Merced River. Merced River downstream channel capacity is 6,000 CFS. That reservoir has never spilled to date. However, when we ran 100 years of different climate and 30 different climate scenarios, looking at different amounts of precipitation change and up to 4 degrees of temperature change. By 2040, peak flows, had that happened in 1956, it would have been double the capacity of their channel. And by 2070, peak flows could have been 4 times their channel capacity. 4 times. So that's a flood risk that you can't just, and that's just one flood event in this period that we've looked at. But the point being is, how are you going to manage that flood risk when it happens? Are you going to continue to build bigger and bigger levees and try to hardscape your way out of it? Or could a part of your portfolio be using FloodMAR to help reduce that flood risk? Now, if you don't do the analysis, it's hard to put some numbers for you to make that decision on, you know, is it worth investing in FloodMAR projects in your watershed?
Thank you. And I think we are a little bit over on our time. Is Lynn and Laura, thank you for having CAMR here to talk to us about this. This is sounds like a great project. We have a lot of engagement and questions that have been asked today. And thank you for putting your information in the chat and the location so that we can follow up with you. Each and every member can do that. Lynn, Laura, is there any other questions or comments you'd like to make?
Well, one, I just want to let everyone know that Kamyar has agreed he'll be able to stay, I think, for the remainder of the meeting. Is that right?
Yes.
So maybe there's a chance, I think we can try to, since there's so much interest, you know, we can also table some of the other items, at least under later on the agenda, if possible, and make them really short. So there might be a chance for follow-up after the meeting, or if anyone's able to stay. Which I know most people have completely packed schedules. But I also just wanted to call, there was a question from Jordy Scully from Senator Lamone's office, and had asked about benefits of recognizing aquifers as natural infrastructures. If there was anything else that you wanted to say about that at this time, and that's probably a much larger conversation, but that question had been raised. I think there's an interest in hearing about that potential.
Thank you, Jordy, for that question. You know, we've looked through the statutes and tried to see if anywhere aquifers were identified as natural green infrastructure in California, and up to now we haven't been able to. There are ample instances where forests and wetlands and riparian corridors are identified as natural infrastructure. And so, I mean, legislatively, certainly there could be added to the water code this recognition, but also, again, as I know there's water bond discussions going on now, in the short term, the nearer term, if that language were included in a water bond, I think it would provide greater incentive and opportunity to use public dollars for the purpose of replenishing aquifers. And again, there's a number of ways that you can replenish aquifers, including groundwater recharge.
Okay, thank you,
Right.
Laura.
I guess, Laura, what I can do is, you may have heard of the California Economic Summit, and we've been participating in the last few years. We put a fact sheet or recommendation sheet about this. So I'll send that to you, Laura, and please share it with committee members.
Great, I'll do that.
And I wanted to thank all of you for this opportunity. I know you've gone over time and I appreciate the interest. And again, whether today or in the future, we'd be happy to continue this conversation.
Yeah, if you're willing, maybe there'll be a chance we can talk after about maybe a follow-up, like you said, discussion meeting for those more interested. And there can be a lot more discussion and back and forth the questions, because I'd love to hear, I think we'd all love to hear kind of brainstorming if there's ideas that people are thinking of right now of ways of using FloodMar to enhance some of the projects maybe they're already been thinking of or have already been looking at for the future for Santa Clara River Watershed, and if there's ways to use what we've heard today to really enhance that.
So just as a tagline, often when we talk with folks who are looking at improving water supply reliability in the valley, particularly groundwater sustainability, we ask them, have you talked with your flood managers? And they often have this stare, and the answer is no. And it's not something we're accustomed to doing. So I think first and foremost is to create opportunities for the water sectors to have more dialogue about how this can benefit each other.
Yeah, thank you for suggesting that, Camiar. We do have someone from that district here and a number of them that participate regularly in this committee. So this is really a part of our IRWM program, this committee and the other watershed groups. So we do have a fair amount of discussion about those overlapping interests. And
I think your committee has something in its name that really sets you up to do this, and that's the word watershed. A lot of other areas don't think that way. So you've already, I think, come a long way.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really do appreciate it all. Okay, we need to move on. I know that we've been getting some information on others. It's really hard to shorten a really good presentation. Really good information. I hope we're going to talk about this again. Next up is our Santa Clara River GSA updates. We have a round table for questions and status report. I know that Brian Bondi, it sounds like he had to jump off to another meeting for Mound. Laura, do we have any update from him? Did he leave any notes or anything?
Not at this time.
Okay. And then our Fillmore Piru groundwater basin. Tony, I know we're going to talk about the GDE, but is there anything else you want to mention?
Yes, I would. I'll try to keep it moving because we're short on time. I would like to say, just as a transitionary comment, is I think in the Fillmore and Piru basins, being that they are very low urbanization and there is water that comes out of both sides, both mountain fronts, there are opportunities to do that over there. And the geology is such that there probably are areas that you could put water into the ground. That's not the place that the Fillmore and Piru Basin GSA is at this point. We're trying to get our plans done on time, but that is something that I think, that's a very smart board and creative thinkers. And so I think there are some opportunities there. They would be smaller projects probably, but maybe you start with doing some mapping, and that's something that I can bring up to the Fillmore and Piru GSA when we take a breath after our initial plans. I just wanted to do, Laura gave me some thought-provoking questions, and I thought I would have one-line answers, but as I was thinking about these, I have a few observations, and I had a few slides, but I think I'm just going to talk through these quickly as just some thought-provoking comments. So Laura asked, what are some observations regarding the basins? And I flipped this one over. And I've been around this area for a long time, but I did not realize the gradient of the Piru Basin. it's a pretty steep gradient. So those basins fill up, but they also spill out to the Fillmore Basin pretty quickly. So if you add water to them, they fill up, but they convey that water to the next basin down the way pretty quickly. And so does the Fillmore Basin. So we're in a year right now, which I think much of the valley has about 3 inches of precipitation. And yet down in the Santa Paula Basin and near the Freeman Diversion, we still have water flow in the river. And it's not because of rain this year, it's because of the water that's piled up in those upstream basins that's flowing downward. So it's an interesting characteristic about that basin. And I didn't realize how quickly that basin will move water towards the west, even with, even if you remove pumping impacts, it moves. And the Fillmore Basin also does that. It has a little bit more storage. Those basins being right near the river and more recent alluvium, the groundwater levels fluctuate a lot. And so it's not analogous to something like the Tulare Basin, which, it's more of a bowl. I think a lot of times when you think about a basin, it's thought of as a bowl, and these, when there's water added, they recharge very quickly, and the water levels can go up quickly. And then when there's not water added, they go down quickly, and they respond very quickly to releases from Santa Felicia Dam when United releases some water for that. And one of the major impacts is droughts, because there's very little import added. There's some that's added up in the Santa Clarita area, but they see the major trends when we have the 5-year droughts, the late 40s and early 50s, 7-year drought. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. There are 2 significant groundwater dependent ecosystems that are there are more, but there are 2 that are more influenced by what happens in the basin at the Piru and the Fillmore Basin boundary. Kristen's going to talk about those in a little while. There's also the one at the Fillmore Santa Paula Basin boundary. There's also one that's up on the top end of the Piru Basin, but not much that goes on in the Piru Basin has any control over that. That's more influenced by what happens in the Santa Clarita area. And there aren't very many wells that are in that zone. Water budgets and modeling. I was going to show a couple slides on those, but we did develop some pretty good water budgets for both of these basins. The planning is being done together and overseen by the agency. Of note is really there are, as we looked at future assumptions and as we coordinated with the Santa Clarita area, there are really relatively minor changes in water usage by humans. And so, we have full development of the area in agriculture, and agriculture changes to urban at a relatively small rate in the valley. There's not much urbanization, and even if Fillmore expands quite a bit, it's not going to be that much different in the acre feet per acre usage as compared to tree crops or the things that are there. So that makes it easy for us to deal with. And then we were expecting some fairly major changes in the inputs from the Santa Clarita area, and it's not really looking like that. So in coordination with the upstream GSA, it doesn't look like there are planned major recycled projects that would take some of that flow from the wastewater treatment plants and remove it. That was several years ago. That was thought to maybe represent 6,000 to 8,000 acre feet removed from the system every year. And at least in the planning that we're doing now, that doesn't look like it's happening. We are, as I'll advertise again on our schedule, is we are working very hard on trying to thoughtfully consider groundwater dependent ecosystem needs and I can't imagine a board that has more thoughtfully considered the sustainable management criteria, so minimum thresholds and objectives. And there's been excellent work on that, but we are at the point where we have to decide. So if you would like to participate in our meetings, we have a special meeting where we're trying to get towards wrapping this up, coming up on the 1st. And as I said, all the technical documents are available on the website. We are still on track for public review GSPs, one for each basin in approximately mid-June. And Laura asked about future studies. One thing I just want to point out, compared to many basins in the state, even some that are critical basins, we have an incredible wealth of data in our area. So we have some long-standing groundwater levels records. We have stream flow records that are excellent here. So compared to many GSAs, we have very, very good information. That being said, and we have a working groundwater model. That being said, one of the projects the GSA has already committed to do is improving its data gathering near the Santa Clara River. And so we can do better planning regarding the groundwater dependent ecosystems in the future. So we have several wells that were either basically expanding our monitoring network in those shallow aquifers that would most strongly affect stream flow. So that's happening as the first major project. And then Laura asked about stakeholder engagement, and I'm just incredibly impressed by that particular board and agency from the very beginning. We have board members, I think, who were really, really engaged in this. And so the agency is formed by a JPA with the county, the city of Fillmore, and United Water were the member agencies, but right away they very wisely decided there should be stakeholder representatives for the pumpers in each of the basins, and a representative for environmental stakeholders. And I would say especially those stakeholder representatives have taken their jobs very seriously and communicate with their constituencies and bring those concerns back, and there has been very good engagement on that. But I think it really starts with the board. And one thing we also did that I think was tough, but it was helpful, is the board decided to develop a guiding principles document that's available on the website. So when things get tough, you can read that and say, we agree to try to solve these things together. And it was quite an effort to put together a robust stakeholder engagement plan. We busted our budget a little bit on the stakeholder engagement, but that is such a critical part of Sigma that I think we've been very wise in making that major emphasis of effort. And I one comment on COVID. I think that was a bit of a bump in the road. We, like everybody else, had to adjust on that. I think we've done very well with our stakeholder workshops and our board meetings and continuing to make those open via Zoom. We've haven't had anybody do a technical assault on any of our meetings yet, so hopefully our security doesn't break down. I think the one place that we may have suffered through COVID was we had an outreach program with an ongoing effort to reach out to disadvantaged communities. And some of that might be in-person meetings in small locations for people who maybe don't have as good a connectivity. And of course, those haven't been able to happen. Maybe they'll be able to happen as we go forward, but that's probably the one place that we have still tried to have those, but I think a lot of folks in the community have just had their plates full over the past year, and I think there probably are some people from the disadvantaged communities that we may have missed, but I'm not sure what we could have done differently under the circumstances. So that's sort of my thought-provoking observations regarding the Fillmore and Piru Basin GSA.
Thank you very much. And I'm chair of that. I just want to say thank you to all the stakeholders that have shown up and sent emails in. Even though COVID and so forth, I think we're going to get to a really good place to submit our plan. And our board knows that this is a fluid plan. So the points, the markers that we hit and put into the plan gets updated. And so we'll be moving those as needed as well. So thank you for everything. Are there any questions for Tony in regards to the Fillmore Piru groundwater? We usually run through this so quick, so I appreciate answering some of the questions that Laura had provided you to make sure we update everybody. We have Santa Clarita Valley. Rick, are you on?
Yes.
Hi, Rick. Go ahead.
Thanks, Supervisor Long. I've got a brief update to give too, and I'm having some interesting internet issues today. I can see everybody's moving, but about every minute the audio cuts out for 3 seconds. So I don't know if you'll experience that coming from me. If you do, I apologize. So yeah, that was a great update, Tony, and we're in a similar track, with your basin. We also have a stakeholder advisory committee. It's turning out to be a really great group to help pull in stakeholder input and guide the process. We've got representatives from business, environmental, 2 at-large members, and then we have some pumper representatives too. And let me just run through my notes here. A couple things on schedule. We do have a special GSA meeting today. We're going to talk to the board about the sustainable management criteria and stakeholder input so far. We'll have a workshop on June 9th on projects and management actions. And then, Tony, our public draft GSP is scheduled to go out in August, so a month or so later than yours. Also, I appreciated what you were saying, Tony, about the way the Piru Basin drains. We've been trying to convey information in our basin about that too, about some of the ways our basins drain. We have interest from stakeholders, a lot of interest about GDEs. And we do have some groundwater dependent ecosystems in the upper part of the watershed, but not a lot of wells up there. And those areas are primarily controlled, groundwater levels are primarily controlled just from the natural hydrology, the steepness of the terrain, and the water draining out of the basin. So we've been working to explain that to stakeholders. We do have an area lower in the basin that we're planning a special GDE monitoring area for. And we've been talking with stakeholders about how that would work and what would cause certain actions. So a lot of good discussions on that. In our basin, a lot of the key interest is on the habitat in the river system, and as we get lower in the system becomes a lot more complex because we've got the inflow from the water reclamation plants, more pumping, more urban runoff, invasive species like arundo, but then we also have protected species there. And we've also got some good input from a groundwater model expert review panel, of which Dr. Sun is a member. And so it's great to have an independent look at our model. Dr. Sun, Nate Brown, Jim Rumbaugh are on that panel. And so we're in the thick of it too, Tony, and special meeting today talking about sustainable management criteria and others on the way. So that completes my update. Happy to answer questions if you have any.
Does anyone have any questions for Rick? All right, thank you. Then we will move on to the Fillmore Piru Basin Groundwater Dependent Ecosystem Technical Report. Tony, do you want to cue this up or just move it right to Christian?
I can cue it up. One of the things that our Fillmore and Pirate Basin GSA board did was we have a consultant team, Daniel B. Stevens and Associates, and the board was very engaged in selecting the consultant because it was so important to try to achieve the objectives of an excellent plan. And so part of the Daniel B. Stevens team is Stillwater Sciences, who is very active and well-respected, Berkeley-based firm, and very well respected in our watershed. And Christian has been leading this effort, as well as Bruce Orr, who is one of the principals of the company. So Christian's he probably just has enough time to give you a teaser on this, but I believe we do have his presentation from last week on our website that you could review. So I'll be quiet and introduce Christian to present today. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. I'm actually going to hand off to Bruce Orr today, who's going to give because it was decided that he could do a much better job giving this in a short period of time than I could, because I get lost in the details. So, Bruce.
Bruce, you're on mute.
Bruce, I can't hear you. I don't know if others can, but it's very faint. Or you're still on mute.
He's on mute.
Okay.
There we go.
All right, sorry, I was calling in via the phone, and I guess I skipped a step here. Oops, let's see. Now, let's go back and see if we can get the presentation. Okay, is everyone seeing my slide presentation now? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. All right, well, as Christian said, he gave and Tony mentioned, Christian gave a more detailed, in-depth presentation last week to the GSA, and I'll just try to give a quick higher level overview, especially in light of our time constraints today. We'll just briefly review what are GDEs, or groundwater dependent ecosystems, talk about our approach, and then move into some of the summary findings to date. And as mentioned previously, there'll be a special meeting next week on April 1st to allow more input on this from the public. So what are groundwater dependent ecosystems, or GDEs? And the DWR and the legislation defines them as ecological communities or species that depend on groundwater emerging from aquifers or on groundwater occurring near the ground surface. So in practice, this often means we're focusing on wetlands and riparian vegetated communities and looking at the tree species and their rooting depths, but we're also focusing on interconnected surface water. So which of the surface waters that we see in the two basins are likely connected to the aquifers, to groundwater? And how is that important for affecting the ecosystem, and also special status species, which under the definition of GDEs being used, species themselves can be considered as a GDE. We'll be talking about some of the key groundwater dependent ecosystems in the two basins. I just wanted to briefly mention this slide. Some of you will remember the historical ecology study done for Ventura County, led by San Francisco Estuary Institute about 10 years ago. And there were three main persistent GDEs in our study area, plus a fourth one, the West Grove down near the estuary. So you can see the upper slide shows the historical condition. There's the Del Val or Del Valle riparian complex up towards the upper end of the Piru Basin and the county line, the Cienega in the middle, near the current fish hatchery, and then the East Grove near the present day Hedrick Ranch nature area. So what is our basic approach? A large part of the GDE effort is focused on classification and mapping of communities. So we focus first on plant communities that occur in the area. Then we look at the plant species associated with those communities, particularly the dominant species. We look into existing information we can use from literature as well as local information on how deep are their roots, and then relate that to the depth of groundwater in those areas. And then the third step is looking at that extent of interconnected surface water. And luckily in our case, we have high quality vegetation mapping data at fairly recent at fine resolution because of the Section 6 grant funded work that Stillwater did a couple of years ago to update the vegetation mapping for the Santa Clara River from the mouth all the way up to through Santa Clarita to the confluence with Bouquet Canyon. And then for areas that are outside of the mapping area we did, we have older CalVeg data, which is CalVeg is mapping done statewide, so it's necessarily at a coarser scale. And that just means we have to look at it more carefully when we're interpreting it for potential GDEs. So what are our basic results so far? We've identified 7 GDE or potential GDE, well, 7 GDE units, and the degree of groundwater dependence for these units and our level of confidence in that varies. 3 of these, the historical ones I mentioned before, Del Val and the Cienega and the East Grove, are associated with known areas of rising water, like rising groundwater, and are definitely GDEs. If you look at this map in the middle, the orangish tone is the Santa Clara River riparian shrubland. And that's less certain, but it seems at least portions of that GDE unit seem likely to be connected to groundwater, at least seasonally, but probably not perennially. And then three additional units are these tributary units, and we have much less data on groundwater dependence and what's going on in those systems. So what I'd like to do for this talk, just to keep it focused, is drill in a little bit more on the 3 main GDE units. So Del Val or Del Valle riparian complex at the upstream end of the Piru Basin. And this is an area, as I mentioned, area of known rising groundwater and historical forested wetland complex, or cottonwood, willow, and wetland associations, dominated primarily by the natives by Fremont cottonwood and red willow, as well as mule fat, but it also contains some non-native invasive species, especially arundo and tamarisk. And the rooting depths of the cottonwoods and willows generally are 7 to 10 feet. And one thing I just wanted to mention is this area also, as previously discussed, has effluent releases from Los Angeles County coming downstream. And so one of the areas for future investigation would be just keeping a track of that and understanding how important those releases might be for maintaining the GDE. In the slide, the graph on the left just shows the main vegetation types. So you can see the tamarisk, red willow, riparian forest or woodlands, mule fat thickets, Fremont cottonwood, and then the invasive giant reed, arundo types, just to give you a sense of the distribution of the main vegetation types in that unit. Then if we move downstream to the center of our area, right at the transition from the Piru to the Fillmore Basin, we have the Cienega riparian complex, and portions of this complex are in Piru Basin, and other portions are in the Fillmore Basin. So the graph in the lower left just shows the distribution of the vegetation types by the basin that they actually overlap with. And again, this is another historical wetland riparian complex, known area of rising groundwater. And prior to the recent multi-year drought, we had pretty extensive development of cottonwood and willows, which died during the drought. And there's been research done on that by Chris Klibler at UCSB, and he has given a presentation to the GSA board previously on his research and how it relates to what's going on at the site. And so now we have some willows and other native riparian species remaining, but mainly it's mule fat, and there's been a lot of arundo, although there has been a fairly recent active arundo removal efforts implemented at the near the fish hatchery and the Cienega site. Then moving downstream to the East Grove riparian complex. This is sort of the best remnant and representative example of what we think the historical wetland and riparian complexes look like on the river. It's another area of rising groundwater. It's still the largest and most intact of the units along the river, dominated by cottonwood and willows. And once again, as I mentioned earlier, their rooting depth is generally 7 to 10 feet. There's a lot of mule fat in various portions of this GDE unit, and mule fat rooting depth is much shallower. So that's another factor to consider when we're trying to relate the plant species mix with the depth of groundwater. And on the chart to the left, you can just see the dominant vegetation types. And right in the middle, we have, once again, some invasive arundo there, but there already have been arundo removal activities. So we've greatly reduced that compared to what was there previously, but it still is an issue. Next, I just want to move on to sort of the linkage between the GDE, potential GDE mapping, and then our understanding of groundwater, depth of groundwater in various areas, based both on modeling and on well data. And in this example, the previously model results predicted that climate change was not likely to significantly alter the groundwater levels on average. And as Tony mentioned previously, these multi-year droughts really have the largest impact on GDEs, with lowering of the groundwater level, in some cases below the rooting depth of the vegetation. And let's see. So that chart on the lower right for the Cienega is from a well near that GDE unit. And you can see that at various points in previous droughts historically, and then most recently, the recent 5-year drought, you can see a water level declining of up to 30 feet. So that's presumably part of what was responsible for the dieback of cottonwoods and willows during the drought, as at least in some areas, the groundwater level presumably dropped below the rooting depth of those trees. The East Grove, you can see, has sort of high frequency fluctuation, but sort of the long-term trends are more stable. And one thing you have to be careful in interpreting well data relative to the GDEs, like in this case, the well data and the well that we're showing here is located on a higher terrace. That's generally 10 to 20 feet above the elevation of most of the GDE. So while this well shows a drop below depth of groundwater down to like 30 feet, the GDE itself might have only experienced something more in a drop in the 10 to 15 foot level, which would be a less severe impact. So the other issue we need to give attention to is this issue of rising groundwater and the interconnectedness of groundwater to surface water. And luckily, we have this nice series of maps produced by United Water, starting in the beginning of the drought. So in that upper left, you can see the circles represent the surface flow amount, and then the solid lines represent areas of actual surface flow. And as you can see, as the drought progresses, basically the amount of flow reduces, the size of the circles decreases, as well as the length of that flowing reach of river, until down in that lower left, November 2017, we see it's been greatly restricted. And luckily, we've been seeing some bounce backs since the multi-year drought ended. But this map series gives us a good idea of the sensitivity of surface flow in the system to changing groundwater conditions. I think in the interest of time, I'll just skip through this quickly. One of the things we're trying to do is use remote sensing to track the health of the different GDE units, and essentially using Landsat satellite imagery, we can use what's this NDVI, or normalized differential vegetation index, to basically see how much of the vegetation is healthy and green versus how much is stressed and sort of brown. And so that's at the high level, that's what we're looking at. And here are two results I wanted to show. So here is the Cienega riparian complex near the Fillmore Fish Hatchery. And basically what we've done here is using the satellite data, we've tracked changes in each pixel from the satellite imagery. So each pixel represents a 30 by 30 meter cell. And over this period of 2012 to 2016, we're trying to see, does that vegetation index show that that pixel is going from green to brown, or is it going in the other direction? If it's tending towards the becoming browner, basically being more stressed, then that shows up as red in the lower image. And it's actually showing more green, becoming presumably less stressed, then that would show up as blue. And this just gives you a sense that the whole Cienega GDE unit in general suffered significantly during the drought. And then to compare that with the downstream historical East Grove, we have a similar map. And in that lower figure, you can see that there were areas, the upper part of the GDE unit, the upstream portion, was more sensitive to changes during the drought. And that makes sense as like we showed in that previous series of maps, the amount of area subject to surface flow was decreasing. So essentially that area in the upper right of this graph, upstream area, you can think of as more of a transition zone. That's going to be where you're going to see most of the effects as groundwater drops and surface flow decreases. But luckily, the majority of this unit shows up as blue, and actually indicating it was doing quite well during that drought period. And this, this just builds on the historical ecology study that has indicated through a variety of different data sources that this is one of the key areas that has persisted on the river for centuries. And then I think I'll just skip through this, but just as a reminder, we're also looking at the special status species individually. We're looking at plants, terrestrial wildlife, and fish, as well as natural communities. And then also critical habitat for 4 species. So there's just a tiny little bit of the condor critical habitat shown in red that overlaps with the basin boundaries. But really the 3 species that are of more concern are Leesville's vireo, southwestern willow flycatcher, and Southern California steelhead, given the extent of critical habitat that overlaps with the basins. And here's just a summary slide. So to wrap it up, we identified 7 GDE units in the 2 basins. And the three GDE units that I focused on are in areas of rising groundwater and experience more perennial flow. We've talked about the different types of groundwater dependent vegetation and what happened during the drought. So I won't go into any more detail on that, but just at the bottom, I've added email addresses for Christian and myself. And then at the very bottom, just a reminder that the previous more detailed talk, it was recorded, as well as the presentation are posted on the GSA website. And there's the website for future reference. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if there's time, or just move on.
And Bruce and Christian, this conversation went a lot faster today than it did at our Fillmore Pyru. I'm like, dang, you just blew through that. So I have to say, well done. But I'm sure there's a lot of good questions out there. Laura, I'll hand this over to you if you want to run that part of it.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So we'll give a few more seconds if anybody has a question. Unmute.
Well, I will like to ask, we have requested from all our stakeholders to submit your questions, your concerns to the Fillmore Pyru groundwater. So it's on our website, ftbgsa.org. Go there. All of our technical information is there. I believe this one is included. The videos Tony Emmerich summarized earlier will be on that site. And we will need to be putting in a deadline to get input because we have to get through the sustainable management criteria to do the plan. And every time we're discussing these things, which is great, don't get me wrong, but then that puts back the deadline. And since we have DWR on here too, we are very important. It's very important for us to hit our deadlines. We understand. and so COVID or no COVID, we still have to do that. So we're asking for all of our stakeholders to read the technical memo and to get back. I think it's 67 pages, or it's a big technical memo with a lot of good information. So Bruce and Christian, thank you so much for the update. And then also we will have a more elaborate presentation on April 1st at 5 o'clock at our groundwater meeting. Did I miss anything, Tony?
I would just emphasize that, you know, the Fillmore and Piru Board is primarily going to be accepting comments on this GDE tech memo at the special meeting on the 1st. And so we encourage anybody who's planning on commenting, either verbally or in writing, it would be most helpful if you could submit it to us by the 1st. And, you know, we know that's quick, but it's an important issue, and it ties to other things. So we would greatly appreciate if you could get us comments by that meeting.
Yes.
And I forgot to point out that the backdrop for my Zoom feed was taken at the Cienega site, basically at the Fillmore Fish Hatchery. So if you haven't been there, it's a great area.
Great, thank you so much. With no other questions, appreciate your time and information. We'll move on to the Watershed Coordinator update.
Thank you. So I'm going to make this quick. So I just want to let you all know that the Invasive Weed Task Force, which is a subcommittee of this group, has been continuing to meet quite frequently over the last couple months. And our, main objective, well, we really have the driver for our most recent meetings has been the opportunity from Coastal Quest. They attended a meeting, I think maybe it was our last meeting 2 months ago. And since then we've been working with them. They've really come to us with support. Sorry, getting all the spam phone calls. They came to us with support from Southern California Edison to engage with our watershed on building fire resilient communities. So they've really been focusing with our task force members on how they can help us add capacity to help us move forward on filling the gaps that our group has already identified over the last couple of years. A lot of our stakeholders have been really engaged in planning, research, and restoration in the watershed already, but there's still some gaps that we've been wanting to address, and it's been challenging, of course, because everyone has such a full plate already to build that capacity among our groups to really make substantial progress. So in our conversations, we're really digging into permitting issues, programmatic, and kind of streamlining those permits. Also talking about building stronger governance structure so we can go about collaborating and coordinating watershed wide. And also one goal is developing a strike force crew that could, do work on arundo removal, post-fire, post-flooding, having all the permitting and the workforce development in place. And, really a focus on more weed removal, not necessarily restoration, through the lens of fire risk prevention. So all of that we've been kind of coalescing around and putting down on paper, and we're working on applying for an Ocean Protection Council grant coming up. I think it's due in April. And then continuing to move on, looking at other funding opportunities. So if you're interested in joining that conversation and you aren't already, I've said this dozens of times before, but please email me and I will add you to that invasive weed task force subcommittee list. It was nice that our most recent meeting we have had now added participation from Ventura County Fire. So we appreciate that as well. Also, I just wanted to bring up on the agenda, I put something about SB 45. So this was something that came up actually from during our invasive weed task force conversation. Looking at down the road, future funding opportunities. And I'm just going to share right here. If you haven't, I have this document. If you haven't seen SB 45, this is, I think, back in December, the latest version of the different pots of money. But I'm just kind of interested to hear from stakeholders if this is something you wanted to talk more about at this watershed committee, or if there's groups interested in advocating for SB 45, or that already are. It was something that actually Santa Clarita Valley Water Agency has their eye on, and Steve Cole has mentioned that they're willing to help support the invasive weed task force or the watershed committee in advocating for money to be included in SB 45 that could be used for watershed-wide weed removal, restoration projects, maybe even broader. We can think more broadly about trails along with that, access. So I just wanted to bring this up because from what I have heard, it's kind of a now is the opportunity to try to talk about making sure that there's money in here that we could access either through grant funding through some of these agencies and the grant programs that already exist, or try to see if there's an opportunity to have something designated more clearly for Santa Clara River watershed. And I'm not all that familiar with how lobbying and all this works, so I'm going to open it up if there's any other feedback from our committee members on this item.
Thanks, Laura. Can I add to what you just said? There's actually 2 climate resilience bonds that are being looked at by the legislature, by the committees. One is SB 45 and the other one is AB 1500. We're going to be having a WCVC steering committee meeting next week, and we'll be discussing this on that agenda as well. Not just for this watershed, but for the IRWM region and what we might want to be asking for if we have an opportunity, or when we have an opportunity to do that. And I am going to be sending out a message to the WCVC group, which Laura can forward on to those of you that may not be on that list, to give you some more information about the 2 bills. And we are working through the roundtable of regions to come up with some constructive feedback on how to proceed with our advocacy for different elements of what's included in that. Now, Sue Hughes, our government affairs person for the county, I mean, we have some limitations for what we can lobby for as the county, or it's up to the county board how we do that. However, I think this committee can certainly be making pointed suggestions and comments of things they would like to see. So stay tuned for a little bit more information on this as far as from our kind of the larger stakeholder group in the county.
And Lynn, I did send you, there is a coalition meeting with the Assembly Bill 1500. So I sent you that information in regards to what they were looking at, what request, putting it in writing.
Thank you.
So thank you.
So I guess
Okay.
I'd like to ask the group if there's any direction, that this committee, would like to take in having this as a side conversation. I think we could talk with the Santa Clarita Valley Water Agency. I don't think Steve Cole is on this meeting, but like I said, they've offered they have a lobbyist, and they offered to, I think maybe just it'd be helpful to hear people's interests or concerns and what they would like to see potentially added to this that would benefit the watershed. we could just start with that kind of conversation hosted by Santa Clarita Valley Water Agency. So I could take that back to Steve Cole if that's something people are interested in, and see if he's willing to host a meeting. But I just was looking for any suggestions on, you know, if there's a way for us to collaborate and work together on a possibility of trying to get some more directed funding for Santa Clarita, for the watershed.
I think we should, Laura. I mean,
Okay.
maybe that's, I mean, that's a separate meeting or a small group to think about some of those, but it's always worthwhile putting the input in.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll talk to Steve Cole and see what opportunity we have there, and I'll try to include, I'll send a message out with the watershed committee if just this will be more maybe just a side meeting for those most interested in having that conversation. Thank you. And I will leave it at that for now then. Let's see. And I just wanted to remind everyone though that our next meeting is May 27th. There will be a meeting that day. So that's 2 months from now. You already have a couple items, if I remember, on that. One item on the agenda, hopefully, is the tentative items about a Caltrans county stormwater collaborative project we might hear about. So just mark that on your calendar. And, you know, this meeting, I just want to also say that there's been so much interest in the DWR Floodmar conversation and the GDE presentation. So we've been shortening our meetings to 2 hours. I know at the last meeting, I also tried to have some questions and feedback on our meetings going forward, since they will probably remain virtual for at least a while longer. So I've been working on sending out a survey. I haven't finalized it to all of you to gauge your interest in how you feel that these meetings have been going and how we can serve you in terms of scheduling them and the length and frequency and topics and such, and how to move forward to transitioning if we're going to transition back to more in-person meetings. So I appreciate your understanding, and it's always a challenge to kind of gauge how long items and how much interest there are. So it's a good problem that we have so much interest, and I thank you all for your patience.
Laura, are you skipping over my item? I just had a couple of announcements.
No, I
You're
just
moving to yours.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, this has been a great meeting. These are always great meetings. I just wanted to make a couple of quick announcements. I know we're almost out of time. Just briefly, Laura and I have been working to continue on that disadvantaged community and tribal engagement project with Proposition 1 funding. It's actually, we're in a really good place right now doing a lot of outreach through community surveys and institutional surveys. And there's also a tribal engagement element, which I probably need to circle back with you, Julie, on how that's going, because we've had a few glitches with that. So in our funding area-wide effort. So, but we're excited. We're getting some good feedback from community members on the surveys. And Laura and I are working closely with our consultant team to make sure that our unique needs and outreach methods are effective in making sure we get the input we need through the needs assessment. Then we'll be moving on to the next phase, which is project development based on the needs. And that's going to be a very intense phase of this grant. We just extended the grant. I'm not sure if we announced this at the last meeting, but the grant's been extended. It was supposed to expire last December. It will now expire in December of 2022. So we've given ourselves more time. COVID really slowed us down, and just the sheer size of our funding area has also made this project a little bit more challenging. But we're excited to see where things are going now. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Laura. And we are working with, we are trying to work with the GSAs, and thank you for saying that, Tony, about the Fillmore Piru Basin, because you were great giving presentations at some of our public outreach Zoom events, and we really appreciate that. I already mentioned that we're having a steering committee of the WCVC next Wednesday. I'm going to be sending out a notice and a link on Zoom to that if you want to be part of that conversation. The steering committee hasn't met in quite a while, so we have a lot to talk about. Also, the Prop 1 grant agreement with the state for the first round of implementation funding. Just as a reminder, if you weren't aware, that grant is being accepted by the Cayugas Municipal Water District on behalf of the Watersheds Coalition. And I believe we're in the final phase of the draft grant agreement being developed. So we should have a final grant agreement not too far off now. And some of you are project proponents, I see you nodding your head, about probably really anxious to get started on that. There's going to be a workshop with DWR and the IRWM Roundtable of Regions on May 6th at 9:30 in the morning. And that workshop is to assess how things went in round 1 and what kind of changes we would like to see in that process, because it was new, it was different from the previous rounds of funding for IRWM. So they did a survey of all the applicants to ask what they thought of the process, and we'll be reviewing that and going over some of the questions at that workshop. That's a very important part of our relationship with the state, is giving them feedback on what's working and what's not working. And as you probably know, we only have one more round of IRWM funding coming up for Prop 1. And then there are no other IRWM grants out there on the horizon. So we really want to make sure that we get it right on this last round and get everybody together to figure out what projects we want to consider including for that. So that will be the subject of a general membership meeting coming up in sometime in the near future to start getting ready for that. And just back to those bonds that are being considered, you may recall that last year in the legislative session, there were no IRWM inclusions in those bonds that were considered then. And SB 45 is actually one of them. So this year there's a more concerted effort to try to make sure that IRWM funding has a place in one way or another through policy language or actual funding earmarks. For the many projects that we want to do, these are climate resilience bonds first and foremost, and wildfire resilience, but there's many aspects of what we do in IRWM that lead us toward that end, as well as just water resilience in general. So we really are going to push hard this time to see if we can't get IRWM included, so we can move ahead into the next bond cycle with some specific funding for our projects and our programs. So I think that's all I have for now.
Awesome. Well, then do we want to go back to Kemyar and see if there's any further discussions? And if people, it's 11:04, so if people need to go to your other meetings, then thank you so much for attending. But if we can go back to maybe some of those questions that we wanted to follow up with, Laura.
Yeah, Kemyar, if you have a few more minutes, if there's anyone else that had questions, I know there were a number typed into the chat, but since I don't know if all those individuals are sticking around.
Yeah, I can hang in. I did, one of my colleagues, Ajay Goyal, I don't think he's on now. He responded to a few of the questions in the chat while we were talking.
Okay.
I think most all of them are covered, but I'd be happy to take any additional questions that you have. And I did send you, Laura, that handout from the Economic Summit with additional information about considering aquifers as natural infrastructure and other recommendations.
Mm-hmm. I have a kind of a question. There was about possibilities of floodmar used in urban areas, parks and schools, green space. I know floodmar is more directed for agricultural or irrigated lands. Is that right? But I think, you know, like you had mentioned before, that sounds capturing stormwater, you know, that's more of in urban areas, we think of more as stormwater capture for water quality purposes. But is there coordination between potentially floodmar and, you know, stormwater capture projects, water quality permits? You know, I feel like there's often there's a current like disconnect between water quality, stormwater capture for water quality benefits, and flood water recharge for aquifer replenishment.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the principles of stormwater capture and recharge and floodmar are similar. I think it's the urban versus rural setting that is the biggest difference. And you're absolutely right that stormwater management really initiated or began as a water quality management control effort. However, the water board that regulates that or oversees that is now very upfront about the need to consider managing stormwater for water supply as well. And so I think as far as available funding and types of support, doing something in an urban setting, you might get further faster tapping into already ongoing stormwater management efforts than considering it floodmar. But to Tony's point about areas where there are open space and or ag, I think those are very much a part of floodmar.
Okay. Any other questions from anybody? Okay, well, thank you so much for your comments and your knowledge on all of this. It's really just great to share that with all of us. And with that, we will adjourn this meeting. And thank you, Lynn and Laura, for all your hard work every single day on this, and appreciate it.
Ellie, could I ask one question real quick?
Sure, go ahead, Bert.
Yeah, the question I had is in regards to the porosity in urban areas and all the projects there doing recharge basins in the projects, and also in current areas of urban areas when they reconfigure their areas. It would be nice to be able to know the porosity in the areas of those structures or those areas to be able to figure out what's the best area. That's one of the reasons why I was asking about the ability of your system to figure out porosity over urban areas.
So Bert, I'd be happy to follow up with my colleagues who are much deeper into that than I am, and I'll pose that question to them and get back to you, Laura, with whatever they provide me.
Yeah, and Bert, for stormwater capture, more urban projects, I can let you know that the countywide stormwater permittees have, when evaluating opportunities for stormwater capture for water quality benefit, do look at infiltration rates or porosity just through, I don't know how old those maps are, and but they do look at the data that is available. But often I have heard, and this is across the board when it comes to stormwater capture projects, often they end up having to do very site-specific infiltration testing and in order to size their projects accordingly. I mean, they're often trying to capture a certain size runoff, area. So it's about sizing the best management practice, the B&P, according to that. So there's a lot of detailed site-specific information, and often they find that the site-specific infiltration rate is not what was reflected in the data that they have. So I don't know if what you're talking about is something that would be a benefit, or if there would still need to be, of course, a lot of detailed site-specific testing.
No, the AEM technology really is fairly granular. Certainly the aerial is coarser than if you did it on the ground, as I mentioned. But I think for the purposes of groundwater recharge, the detail and the specificity is going to be head and shoulders over what we have now.
Well, that's great.
And that was my thought on it, Laura. That was exactly why I was asking. Because when you get the technological information that you get from the overhead capabilities of a computer generating versus, gee, I think this is going to work, and basically on a who knows area, that's what I was looking at, is the possibility of being able to use that system to be able to better evaluate the data that we have currently.
Well, that'd be great then to get that information, Camille. I can share that on that technology. I had a question when you brought up using also solar on flood managed properties for aquifer recharge. I was just curious, is that, I don't recall if I've ever heard this, but if that's something that maybe United has ever considered for some of their recharge basins?
It is, Laura. We actually had a project that was a partnership with an energy generator that was bidding on the energy distribution contract, so SCE and the other coalition. And that was going to have solar mounted above the existing recharge basins. And I have my doubts if you could still get in there and disc the surface like you have to for a managed recharge basin without running into the poles. But we were game to give it a try. But unfortunately, the provider that was doing that lost out some battery projects. So I think that there's a very high likelihood that that could be done here in the future, because there's not very much electrical generation in the county. And, you know, the transmission lines from the generation to Ventura County are, you know, they're some of the ones that are subject to the high winds and other problems. So, you know, it seems like that's a match, but we'll see. You know, the battery project's won out, but there's still a project that's out there if something would happen within the next year or two.
Interesting. Well, I'd like to think about, wondering if this is something we'll see opportunities as the GSPs are developed and there's a need, if in some of the GSAs, there's the need for reduced water usage, and it results in any of the irrigated lands, you know, the fallowing, or I need to write down those terms that you used, Camille, that you suggested.
Oh yeah, instead of land retirement and fallowing, using repurposing land use.
There you go. If we're going to see repurposing the land use and benefit, you know, if we'll start seeing that sometime in the future, if there's, I kind of had a question if that's been done, how does that work for some of the irrigated lands to go between, I mean, forecasting in advance that their property, you know, it's only going to be benefiting, I guess, river properties, and that they would have to know in advance that they're going to, you know, it's just so unpredictable, I guess I'm saying, with the atmospheric rivers and when you're going to potentially have the opportunity for some of this here, and we don't have such a structural system that we can navigate floodwaters into certain areas. It's such a natural system, which is a great benefit to us in other ways.
You know, there might be some options, especially if you go back into the valley, like in the somewhere in Piru Basin, where you capture some of the flow that's coming out of the canyons and the barrancas. So right now, barrancas just go a straight shot right to the Santa Clara River. And it's one thing to get water out of the Santa Clara River when it's at the lowest elevation in the valley. It might be another thing if you can identify a good recharge area and, you know, compatible land use, that you do a diversion up by the mountain front. Yep. And you divert, you know, on the alluvial fan, or you recharge on the alluvial fan. That seems like that's feasible in this area. And, you know, we'd probably have to do maybe some mapping to identify the best areas geologically and hydrologically, and then look at the cropping that's there. Probably a lot of that's tree crops. So you'd have to look and see, do the crops that are there, are they harmed by that type of thing? And then you'd have to reach out to landowners. But it certainly seems like it would be worth looking into.
Yeah, even if I liked what it was said earlier too, Camille, about what irrigated ditches and just leaving them full longer from floodwater, from rainwater, essentially. It's almost like, sounds like you could go out and plug them up before a storm event and let them sit longer. So I don't know if we have a lot of trees grown here. And so I wonder if those orchards have opportunities for almost creating irrigation ditches that hold water longer. So
I've heard of some folks, I know one person in particular was doing something like that in the eastern part of the Ojai Basin proper, not Upper Ojai, but the Ojai Basin east of the city of Ojai. And they did that very thing on their agricultural property that had, I think, tangerines on there, and they were trying to prevent runoff, so they would have very localized recharge under their orchard. So that was sort of the micro project, but I think that there could be there's certainly a possibility, and that might be that might be kind of a separate small working group to develop that idea more.
Yeah, and to your point, Tony, about the foothill areas, in fact, folks at UC Davis have done some mapping in the foothills and have demonstrated and hypothesized that from the last glacial age, there are some ancient riverbeds that actually feed the deep aquifers. And that if we, through AEM, identify where they are, that those could actually be focused areas of floodmar, directing high flood flows right from the foothills into these ancient riverbed areas. And then it would basically percolate down into the deep aquifers, which, like you said, because of the gradient, works its way down into the lower groundwater basins.
Right. Yeah, certainly sounds feasible.
Yeah.
One thing we didn't really talk about during the presentation, if you could touch on too, Camille, is there's a question in the chat too about why do you think that about nonprofits that have sued over the use of the river, diversions, specifically that affect endangered species like steelhead, how would floodmar, would floodmar result in a similar issue? And also I want to address, if you can tie into that some of the, cultural and historical use, by of the stream, the rivers, and the headwater streams, and just how do you balance all of that? And would there be, are there environmental concerns and with using floodmar in because we're really talking about in some ways diverting water, but it's really also kind of a more natural, when you're talking about, I'm thinking when the headwaters, what's coming out of some of our tributaries, those areas have been confined by development. And so what we're really talking about is reopening them up to the natural floodplain in some cases. But
so you may recall at the end of my talk, I said this is a moonshot and this is not an immediate slam dunk. And that's why it's important for all interests in the watershed to get together and figure out what that balance is. Now, for floodmar, we're again talking about diverting water at peak flow times or in anticipation of that next peak flow coming. And that has to be balanced against environmental aquatic needs. And in part, though, part of the reason our aquatic habitats are stressed, particularly in drier times, is because they're groundwater dependent ecosystems, and that the groundwater has been drawn down to the point where the base flow is reduced, or in some cases, disconnected. So as we replenish these groundwater basins by using these higher peak flows, eventually you're going to build up the groundwater, and that's going to feed the base flow and actually create better habitat for the aquatic systems. And so it's really about timing and amount. And then the other thing that our modeling with climate change is demonstrating is what is peak flow today is not peak flow in 30 years. And even if people agreed to take some differential of what we have now and what we will have then as part of FloodMAR, that will reduce that flood risk, incremental flood risk, while recharging our basins. And as you said, Laura, if before we built those levees, that's what Mother Nature did. When we had those big flood events, it spread it out into the valley areas. Those levees have prevented that. What we're trying to do with FloodMAR is, in a managed way, spread that water out so that it doesn't harm the crops, but it does recharge the groundwater. And also on the GDE presentation, it reminded me of some work that's being done. If you recall, I mentioned the Groundwater Recharge Assessment Tool, or GRAT. The way that works now, Sustainable Conservation, working with whatever area that they're applying this to, come up with what they call a crop suitability calendar. And so they, based on the crops that are there, the amount of water they need, their flood tolerance, they actually come up with a calendar on when and how much water could be diverted during a flood period onto those crops. Well, there's now an interest to create a ecosystem or a species suitability calendar, or calendars. And if that layer were developed for an area, that could be included as input to the GRAT tool, and you could then begin optimizing diversions, not just for what the crops need, but what the species would need, like bird habitat or terrestrial, aquatic.
Thank you. I'm just noting, Julie, it's really nice to see you at at the meeting today. And
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you being here. And I wanted to, I know we have a small group, but if there is an opportunity, if there was any questions that you had, or you also, if you wanted to introduce yourself to Kamyar, it'd be great to hear from you and your perspective.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Laura. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, there's been so much work, and this is such a huge project because our water is so sacred and important to all life. So, how we use it, how it's become a commodity, how it's become war in some cities against others. It has just been one issue that I knew was going to come up and be controversial. The question about the suing, it's not about fixing things, it's about getting money. It's about a sue to settle. So, that's always going to be happening. That's always going to be there. Some of those people who do that don't represent the bigger majority of the Native communities. Education is by far the biggest element that has to happen, the biggest action to convince people that getting rid of the arundo, the eucalyptus on their private properties, and get to the headwaters of all these places so that the water will flow, to bring back in the native plants and restorations of these areas, collecting native seeds from those areas to put back into the land and to restore with its own natural blood and body to restore those areas and get those water plants back in there as the filters that helps everybody. The use of pesticides and all those things. Somebody asked me when I did a sustainability for the city of Ventura last month if I was for poison. And I said, well, no. And when people say, oh, well, that's safe poison, those two words don't go together. there's poison kills. So, you know, but what's our, for like the Arundo removal, but what's the alternative? Other than you going out, I said to the public, and help ripping it out and getting it out of there. Because, you know, the decades and the centuries that people came and colonized this land here by bringing in things that they couldn't live without, animals, plants coming in from their countries, and settled in without a glance or a moment to see how extremely abundant we are here, and how extremely abundant, and that's kind of where I'm trying to head in my world, is to let people know that we still have just about every plant and animal here in our cultural landscape. And so to teach people that connection and that relationship, people who are into the farming and ag industry, you know, up in the upper Delta Central Valley and, you know, our northern end of California, they're planting cotton, you know, these water suckers. It's like, can we, you know, produce things that are a little bit more, you know, land friendly and water friendly? But, you know, again, they're all 4 dams up there. You drive up around in the Sierras and stuff, you just see all these signs, pro dams, you know, we need to dam this water. So, you know, the movement that's coming to the realization that water is going to be really, really scarce, and how we're going to use it. There's so many agencies and people who are doing really good work. I can't keep up with you all and still do my work that I want to do. I will be at some point this year removing myself, or if they don't vote me out, I'm voting myself out of this tribal group. I've been tribal chair for 20 years. Put a fork in me, I'm done. And just go back to my education and start working with the kids. I'm on the Santa Clara River Conservancy Board, and I'm working also with TNC pretty soon. Normally I work with TNC out on the Channel Islands, Santa Cruz Island, but they're part of this partnership and this relationship with the river and anybody else, and looking at ways to reach out to those disadvantaged communities, start making some films, start bringing families out to the river. I've been working with Holly at the fish hatchery with an agency here in Ventura County, TANF, which is Temporary Assistance for Native Families. And we did some educational programs out there, and they were well attended. We're going to try to do some more. And you know, about that whole connection of water and life and all beings, to teach people. It's good to teach them about the plants and the animals there, but what is for them that final connection that touched the heartstone of when you're watching and nurturing plants and watching things grow? What is the other side of that? What did Native peoples and how did Native peoples sustain themselves for the thousands of years and relied? You know, it was their whole world to rely and honor and pray and build that relationship with nature. Because if they didn't, and if they, I'm going to put it kind of, you know, if they didn't pray the right way and make the right offerings, Mother Nature's go, okay, forget it. I'm not giving you the rain this year. You had people observing the oaks, watching the acorns, watching the animals so that they can predict rain. There's just so much that we can go back to help people bring themselves, that it isn't just a bunch of rocks and a bunch of trees. No, they're living beings, they're sacred beings that need respect. I tell people for 200 years, our people haven't been around to acknowledge them, to gift them, to sing to them, to pray to them and put them to work. You know, people they have to switch that kind of other place, and maybe somewhere in there they can see that connection of how important it is to not at this point in life and in time in this planet to let anything around the world go extinct, because we're at a really crucial. And lastly, I'll say is to restore the oak groves and really start planting and getting our rooted people back into the earth, and let them be our air filters and help with this climate change in our air qualities. So, you know, that we did some programs here in Ojai with a group where we went into the schools and they did the science of the oaks, the keystone species, those communities that live within it. And I did the ethnobotany. You know, it's things like that where kids get a chance to get a hands-on. And then we had them go gather acorns in their community. And then after the first rains, we planted them. So it will, I see Tom's, it is complicated because we have so many agencies and so many different people with different ideas, but let's try to narrow it down to some really super basic information and basic needs for everybody. We all need water. How are we going to do it? Don't let money get in the way of this. So everybody's fighting for the money too. So yeah, let's try, if we do get it, let's put it to really good use. And volunteers. There are people who want to volunteer. So we'll teach them how to do that. So thank you. I know I miss all of you guys. It's been a while. So thank you.
Well, we miss you too, Julie, and your
Thanks.
insights and inspiration.
Thank you.
Laura, in regards to that area, just one thing. Are you guys familiar with Harmon Canyon at all? Are you familiar with Harmon Canyon, Julie? No mic. No mic.
I know. No, just
okay.
a little bit. Just a little bit. And what are you referring to in that area?
Well, they just opened it up and it's now open for public use.
Yeah.
And they've got a lot of oak trees up there. I think it's about 600 acres or so up there that they
Wow.
just purchased.
Oh, yes. You know what I am. There
So
was a
it's on
woman
the
I
east end of
connected with.
Ventura. So anybody that's interested, that's a nice area to
That's
walk
right.
up through and
I know.
check out if you guys haven't been around the area at all. That just opened up officially about a week ago.
And to respect it, I want to remind
Yeah.
people,
Yes.
because remember it opening it up is
Yeah.
opening it up to
A lot of
damage
things.
and from people. So
And the thing that brought my mind to it is you were talking about oak trees. There's a lot of
Mhm.
oak trees up there
Mhm.
that I've seen in some of the pictures that are really great because you can
Nice.
actually see them in canopies. So it's a good area to show that area of your nature area.
yeah, and that's owned by Ventura Land Trust.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm in a group of people where we do Ojai Church of the Wild. And so it's usually the first Sunday of every month, but because of COVID, we haven't been meeting. But Harmon Canyon is on our list to bring people. So the idea behind Ojai Church of the Wild is that when we go out to hear the word or logos, it's coming from nature. So we gather, we pay our respects, and then people just go off into nature and sit a spell. And then come back into circle. So Harmon has been on our list as a place to go. And we have a Facebook page for that. So hopefully soon we'll be able to go out and gather again. And
well, Julia, I think, one thing at one of our last meetings that, or more recent meetings and mentioned is that once we are able to gather again, I think it would be fantastic if we scheduled a watershed committee in person outside at one of our locations. We were thinking maybe Sespe Cienega area by the fish hatchery. Because we had talked before COVID about having an invasive weed, more focused meeting out there in person, a picnic in the weeds, as we were going to call it. But I think that maybe we should have a regathering of stakeholders. And I definitely want to make sure that you would be willing to participate in that and lead us as a speaker at that, and maybe we could all go sit a spell in our socially distanced outdoor
absolutely
space at the river.
That'd be wonderful. Yeah, let's do it.
Well, thank you everyone and Camille for sticking around. If there's any final thoughts, we don't usually leave meetings open like this. So
great.
It's been great.
Listening to your remarks, Julie, it reminds me of the other major activity I have been involved with for over 20 years is updating the California Water Plan, the state's strategic plan for water. And I'm really proud that over the last dozen or more years, we have now convened a tribal advisory committee to bring the tribal voices and traditional ecological knowledge into the California Water Plan process. And we have benefited immensely. We've identified about 30 different management strategies, and a few of them, including forest management, were added at the suggestion and recommendation of our tribal participants and members. So traditional ecological knowledge, there's a lot to say about it. And I think it can really help inform the work that we do. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you for that. If there's any information, or you can send the link there, that'd be
Sure.
great. I'd love to check it out.
Happy to do that, Julie.
All right, thank you. Thank you.